Hi, here's the promised video for this section 3.2. 3.1 is actually pretty short, and so I'm assuming that you'll read that, and this discussion is on section 3.2, the topic of experimental design. Before I go on, comment that if you want hard copies of the materials I'm speaking about, lecture notes, you can go on to Learning Studio, and here in the Handouts and Resources folder there's a section 3.2 video lecture. If you click that, you can bring up a link here, and if you click that and open it, you'll see a copy of a PDF file containing PowerPoint slides that I will be going through, so feel free to print that out or not as you wish. I mentioned PowerPoint slides. This topic is much more textual rather than formulas compared to most of the other topics that we'll be doing in the course. So I normally teach this particular lesson with PowerPoint, and I also normally have students have some group discussion, which I'll explain how that would have worked in class if we had done this material in class. So here's the scenario. We want to study the effectiveness of a new drug designed to treat depression. When a large pharmaceutical company like Pfizer or Eli Lilly wants to bring a new drug to market, they have to go through a series of hoops that are set by the Food and Drug Administration to do at least a couple of things. One is to demonstrate that the side effects or the dangers of this new drug are minimal, acceptable. And the other is, of course, to demonstrate that the new drug actually helps the condition that it's designed to treat. So the company has to do experiments to verify the effectiveness. Suppose they have the following scenario. They find 1,000 people, half men and half women, who are currently suffering from depression and agree to be human subjects for a medical study. Let's assume that 6 months is an appropriate time frame for this study. That may or may not be the case for a study on depression, but we'll assume that that's a given. What I'm going to do and would have done in class is pose 6 or 7 scenarios of how the company could set up an experiment to check for the effectiveness of this drug. Here's the first. Have the psychiatrist prescribe the drug to the 1,000 people for 6 months, and then ask or somehow diagnose the people if they feel better. If this had been in class, I would have asked the several groups of students to talk about this and decide what they think is appropriate about this or not. I would suspect on this first one that you're rolling your eyes. There's a huge problem here, several huge problems actually, but the main one is we have no basis for comparison. If most of the people at the end of 6 months say they feel better, how do we know that they would not have already felt better if they had not taken the drug at all? So every study needs a basis for comparison. And so let's try this. Have the psychiatrist prescribe the drug to the 500 people who have suffered from depression the longest. And then, after 6 months, we'll compare with the 500 people who did not take the drug. Okay, this is a little better. We have a basis for comparison, but now you're going to rightly point out that these two groups are not alike. The first group who's getting the drug has had depression a long time. They may have the most severe cases for depression, or perhaps they may be almost over it if this has some limited time duration. We don't know whether either of those is the case, but certainly it's not a good idea to have the group getting the drug be so different than the group not getting the drug and then try and compare and claim things are equal. So let's fix that. Third scenario, let's randomly choose half the people and have them take the drug and the other half not. And then after 6 months, some psychiatrists will evaluate both groups and compare those who took the drug with those who didn't. This is better. This is the best of the three. And it may start to sound okay, but now we need to point out something else. Depression is a psychosomatic illness. It has mind and body interaction. So the drug is having effects on the patient's body. But depression also has, obviously, a mental aspect. And so patients may go through the following process. I know I'm getting the drug. There's a lot of promise in this drug. The company has spent a lot of time in development. The psychiatrists are treating this seriously. And just the mere act of knowing that they're getting this drug may itself impact how they feel. In particular, they may at least partially feel like they're getting better, and that effect may or may not be due to the physical effects of the drug versus the patient's perception of how effective it might be. Or conversely, if you're not getting the drug, then you may have extra feelings of hopelessness and simply not be making progress, not having anything to do with the drug, but more your psychological perception of what's going on. And so that brings up the idea of a placebo. So fourth scenario is we'll prescribe the drug, say, to the 500 women in this study, and a placebo to the 500 men. A placebo, or a so-called sugar pill, is a capsule that would look exactly like the drug, but it would just have some inert material in it that would not do anything one way or the other to the patient. And the patients would not know whether they were getting the drug or the placebo. And then we'll compare the health of the patients after this study. So, okay, now we've removed the effect of psychology of getting or not getting the drug. But if you look at this, then I would hope that you'd have another consideration or complaint about this. We're supposedly giving the drug to the 500 women and a placebo to the 500 men. Well, if you've read anything about depression and how it relates to gender, you know that women have, or at least report, higher incidence of depression than do men. And so gender is a lurking variable here, and that interferes with our ability to describe the impact of the drug. How do we know that it's the drug that's causing the effects versus gender? So there are big problems with this setup. Okay, so let's randomly choose 10 people and give them the drug, and another 10 people will be given a placebo. So the randomization presumably will put some men and some women in the group that gets the drug, and conversely both genders should also be in the placebo group. But now your eye is probably drawn to this 10. Why should we only be, out of our 1,000 people, why should we only be using 10 people to get the drug and 10 people to get the placebo? This doesn't seem reasonable. There are other lurking variables, no doubt, going on that we may know about or even don't know about. And one of the reasons for using a large group of people is to try and overcome the effects of those lurking variables, to have them balance themselves out, so to speak, just by sheer large numbers. For the case of gender, for example, it's very likely, when I take a group of 10 people that are 50% of which are women, when I have 1,000 people, 50% of which are women, and I sample 10 people, that I'm not going to get half men and half women in such a small group. And so let's try another scenario where we'll go back and use the entire 1,000 people. We'll randomly choose 500 for the treatment group who get the drug, and the other 500 people will be in a control group that gets a placebo. and then we'll compare. This is getting pretty good now. So with this many people being chosen randomly, the odds of getting an imbalance of gender, for example, are pretty small. When you choose this many people, they're going to be roughly half men and half women. There is one more thing that's missing, at least one. Here, the issue is that the psychiatrists are people, and they have preconceived ideas probably about how this drug is or is not going to work. They know about previous drugs, they know perhaps what's in this drug and how it's supposedly going to work on the brain. And so what may happen is that at the end, when these psychiatrists are diagnosing patients, in walks a patient, and the psychiatrist knows that this patient, is getting the drug, say. And so he might say something like, "Oh, how you doing? It looks like things are looking up for you a bit, and tell me a little bit about how you feel." And the patient may hear that upturn in voice and say, "Oh yeah, the doctor who knows what he's talking about thinks I'm looking a little better. I think I do feel a little better." Versus another patient may walk in and the psychiatrist says, "Oh well, you look okay. We'll keep working, and I'm sure over time we'll be able to get this conquered." And the patient may be saying to herself, "Oh, the doctor seems like things are kind of flat here, and yeah, that's kind of how I feel, and so all right, I guess we'll keep working, but it's sure not over yet." And so the perception and of the psychiatrist and the interaction of the doctors with the patients may influence how the patients think things are going. And so a real study would need the following. We'll do our 500 in a treatment group and 500 in a control group, but then at the end we'll have an outside group of psychiatrists do the final diagnosis. These are professionals who are trained, but they have no idea who was getting the drug and who was not. That removes the psychiatrist's preconceived notions about how effective this may be. And so any serious medical study would have this requirement that treatment and diagnosis would be separate. So let's summarize here. We are, in this scenario, trying to establish the fact that the drug is causing the patient to get better. If you want to show that, at least 3 features have to be present in your experiment, all of which have already come up in our discussion. One is that you need a basis for comparison. So you do need control groups and treatment groups. The control group gets the placebo, the treatment groups gets the actual medication or whatever effect is being applied. The second thing you need is random placement into these groups. We have to place people randomly to control lurking variables in the background that we probably don't even know about. We talked about gender, but there are other things, ethnicity and economic status and family size and married or non-married and so on. And the idea is that if you place people randomly, then say a lurking variable of marital status, well, roughly half the people by pure chance are going to go into, roughly half the married people are going to go into the control group and half into the treatment group. And so that lurking variable will in effect cancel itself out. If you can't do random placement, completely random placement, sometimes you can adjust for that a little bit, but randomization is good. The third thing you need is repetition. That just means that the sample sizes have to be sufficiently large. We talked about the fact that 10 is not big enough for the randomization to work. By the time you get up to 500, the chances are that random placement will really result in 2 groups, a control and a treatment group that look pretty much alike except for getting the drug or not getting the drug. These 3 things, comparison, randomization, and repetition, you have to have. Then there are other things that are sometimes done. Let's talk about this scenario from World War II and the years leading up to it. At Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps, so-called Nazi doctors did medical experiments with identical twins. So, for example, infecting one twin with a disease and the other not, and then studying how they survival rates and symptoms and so on, or perhaps exposing one twin to a toxic chemical and the other one not, and again investigating how they reacted to that. It was morally repulsive, obviously, and completely unacceptable, but there was a scientific principle going on. The Nazi doctors were using matched pairing. Identical twins have identical genetic makeup, DNA, and so knowing that, for example, some people are just simply more susceptible to a chemical than another, that's kind of a lurking variable going on, the doctors said, okay, let's put one twin in one group, the control group, and another in the treatment group, and then that will cause this lurking variable to kind of cancel itself out. I have a large group of twins, and I compare how the twin in the control group is getting along compared to how the twin in the treatment group is getting along. Another type of matched pairing that is done is matching a person with him or herself at a different time. So if you were studying the effectiveness, for example, of a TV commercial, how much it influenced people's opinions on how well a hamburger tasted, or they thought a hamburger tasted or something. You could have the person try out the food, then watch the commercial, and then try out the food again and compare their opinion before the commercial with their opinion after the commercial. Again, some people just like hamburgers better than others, and so this before and after comparison allows you more closely to home in on what exactly did viewing the commercial do in terms of their opinion. Another optional feature is blocking. In the antidepressant experiment that we talked about, we knew that gender was going to be significant, and so in fact any real serious study of antidepressants would do the following: take the subject pool, immediately split them into men and women, obviously a non-random selection, and then from the group of women split them randomly into control and treatment groups, do the experiment, and come to some conclusion about how effective the medication is in women. And then separately split the men randomly into control and treatment groups and come to some conclusion about how effective the medication was in men. At the end, you may or may not try to put those two results back together, but the blocking has split the effect of gender completely apart. These are separate experiments, and so it controls, it's a way of controlling lurking variables that we do know about. And a third desirable feature that we talked about had to do with the outside psychiatrists, because people who interact with the patients getting the antidepressant may influence those patients by what they say and their tone of voice, how their body language, and so on. It's a principle that neither the patients themselves should know who's getting the treatment versus the placebo, nor the staff that have contact with them. So to not know is to be blind, and the double blinding then means both the subjects and their treatment staff know who's getting the treatment and placebo. Only the people who are running the experiment know, and they have no direct contact with the patient. So, conclusions. The main one is to know the difference between observation and experimentation. If we do an observation of a group of people and we see that, say, smoking seems to be correlated with lung cancer, that's really all we can say from that. There are lurking variables in the background. We don't know about them. We haven't done anything to counter their effects. And so an observational study, just looking at something that has already happened, can show correlation, and that's all. The point of going to all this bother that we've been talking about to set up these groups and carefully determine what happens to each is that we're trying to show cause and effect. A properly designed scientific experiment like we're talking about shows or scientifically proves that the effect has been caused by the treatment because we've removed all other possible explanations. Okay. Give me a moment to hook up my keyboard here, and there's one more thing that I want to demonstrate. The last thing that I want to show then is how to do randomization. If we know that we have a bunch of a group of people and we want to put, say, half of them in the control group and half of them in the treatment group randomly, how can you do that? The textbook talks about using a table of random numbers, and it has a table. That's a little clumsy and it's old-fashioned, and so we won't be doing things that way. But here is an alternative using software. I'll show Excel. It's discussed in the text. And there are other methods of doing this as well. And my fan on my computer is getting noisy, so let me go back and try to do this without the keyboard so that the sound is controlled. Just a moment. Okay, so here is a list of, I guess, 13 people, happen to be my nieces and nephews, and suppose I want to randomly choose 4 of them. So what I'm going to do is come here and assign a random number to each of the people. Not an integer, actually, between 0 and 1, but not an integer, but a random number between 0 and 1. And so, first thing, I'll type an equals sign, and that tells Excel that I'm getting ready to type a formula as opposed to just typing some text. Then the command that we want is rand, so I can type R-A-N-D. And then I need a set of parentheses, nothing in them, just open and closed parentheses to let Excel know that this is actually a function. All right, and then I can push enter, and as I said, a random number between 0 and 1 has been generated and put in this cell. If you're doing this on your own computer, you're probably almost certainly going to get a different random number. That's the whole point. This should be different every time it is done. I could do the same thing in each of these cells, but it's actually easier to come here. There are little crosshairs on the lower right-hand corner. If I left-click and hold, and then drag down the rest of this column, it copies this formula down. Each of these cells has a rand command in it as well, and so I've generated a different random number for each of these. And now the idea is that if I want 4 people, I take the 4 smallest random numbers. So I could look through this list and pick them out. It looks like Kendra is the smallest and so on. A little easier than to have Excel actually find the 4 smallest. So let's sort them. If I go to the toolbar and choose data, and we can choose a sort command. Let's select Okay, it's already picked off this data. If it hadn't, I would have selected cells A2 through B14. Sort by, let's sort by the random number, the second column, and let's do smallest to largest. So when I click OK, what you're going to see is that these names will rearrange themselves. And they have, and Kendra had the smallest number, and she's now on top. Something that's confusing is, okay, these numbers have changed, and what's happened is that every time a cell moves to a new location, the random command runs again, and so a new number was assigned. But you can go with the original ones, and so what I should do is pick out these first 4 people. They, from the original randomization, they had the 4 smallest random numbers. Those are the 4 people that should be picked to go into my, say, treatment group, if that's what I'm picking. All right, so that does it, and I'll stop here. Thank you.